Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our August webinar in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub Expanded Horizons series. This is brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wagaya people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining you from today, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which each of you are joining us today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who may be present today. My name is Prue Cook, I'm from Nine Creeks Consulting, and I'm your host across this series. Now, this series, which has been running for a little over a year now, is for those of us who work with farming and regional communities from policy to the paddock, and it challenges us to think a bit differently regarding how we approach engagement, extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. Through this series, we explore novel thinking and new ideas from different sectors, industries and countries to stimulate new ideas and approaches to collaboration and building rural resilience. So our guest for today is Pete Fitzgerald, who joins us from the University of New England, and we're going to be talking about the Decide and Thrive project, which is a reasonably new project and is aiming to assist livestock producers decide which breeding stock to keep and which to cull when preparing for or responding to drought. And it's using producer behavioural insights to help inform project activities. So anyone who's sat in on these webinars over the last year or so will be aware that, understanding behavioural science is something that we're really interested in informing how we do extension. Also, if you've participated in these webinars before, it's not going to be a PowerPoint with Pete presenting to that. Pete and I are going to have a chat about his work, and we invite you to ask questions or share your own experiences at any time using the chat function. You're also going to be sent a recording of this webinar after it finishes, so please don't worry if you need to leave early. So welcome, Pete. It's so nice to have you here.
Thanks, Prue. Good to be here with you.
Perfect. Let's start. We always want to learn a little bit about our guests, so let's learn a little bit about you. Tell us about the many things that you do in your day job.
Yeah, so I'm a project manager here at UNE, run a whole range of different research projects. At the moment, mostly working with the sheep industry and focusing on genetics. So running a resource flock project, also running around the countryside measuring methane and feed intake on sheep. So trying to develop EBVs for those two traits in the future. And then I've got the Decide and Thrive project as well, where I'm tacked on as sort of an extension type person, communications and whatnot. And then a couple of other projects on the side again, a little bit more with sheep methane and other bits and pieces.
Excellent. And in learning a little bit about you and what you've done in prepping for today's webinar, Pete, you've also spent a lot of time working overseas in international development. Where'd you go and what did you do?
Been all around the shop. I spent a few years living up in Copenhagen, working for a consulting company up there, and didn't have much to do with agriculture, but all sorts of good governance and environment sorts of programs. Came back to Oz about 12 years ago and started running a whole heap of different training courses for ag extension staff from across Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea as well. So done a whole range of things with water, from water and irrigation through to livestock and many things in between. So.
Perfect. So I think that gives you a lovely experience of what extension looks like in different countries and what will and won't work in different areas. So we'll certainly talk about the importance of place-based approaches later on as we get into this. So we're going to focus in on the Decide and Thrive project today. Let's start by, at the real high level, what's this project planning to achieve?
So basically, we're trying to help producers to optimise which breeding stock to cull when they're preparing for or responding to drought. And the focus is on which stock to sell, not how many stock to sell. So there's plenty of other approaches and I suppose, tools out there in the world that can help producers identify how many animals to keep and how many to sell, pasture budgeting, whatever it may be. We're also focusing on breeding stock only, as we sort of found that to be a bit of a gap in the market at this point in time. We're not focusing on stock classes per se, but breeders. Also acknowledging that there are regional differences across the country and across the production zones, and then recognising that everyone's different. Producers have different attitudes toward risk and loss and things like that. So trying to make something that will hopefully be applicable to, as broad a group of producers, breeders as possible.
Excellent. And of course, we've got to give a couple of basics about the project. When does it start? When's it going to end? Where's the funding coming from? And who are the people involved?
Yep. So the project's funded by the Future Drought Fund Innovation Hub, or grants, I should say. It's led by Professor Lewis Kahn here at UNE. It's a collaboration between UNE, CSIRO and Central Queensland Uni. And we've got a number of industry partners as well, so including NAPCO, AACO, Angus Australia and Paraguay. They're providing data and access to their livestock on farm to do monitoring and new trait recording, etc., etc. So the project started at the end of March last year and it runs for about 3 years. So we're due to wrap up 30th of March 2025.
Excellent. And it brings together a very multidisciplinary team. What skill sets did you want to bring into the project and why was this important?
Yeah, it's quite a big thing to bite off, I suppose, in some ways. So we needed a lot of different skills to try and conceptualise what we're trying to do. Also working with producers and making sure that what we develop is actually going to be useful for the end user at the end of the day. So that's where we brought in social scientists. So that's the people side of things, communication extension staff as well. And again, so sort of working with people. There's a lot of farm systems modelling work going on as part of the project. So we've got a number of different modellers, bioeconomic modellers, economists, and then production specialists, particularly in the nutrition area. And then we've got a few geneticists, so the expertise in genetics and genomics. And then, of course, one of the key parts where people aren't necessarily core or paid directly by the project, but that's existing service providers and deliverers. So people who are out there working with the producers, providing advice and guidance, and obviously the producers themselves. So we're hoping to deliver, an output, a tool, whatever that may look like, whatever that may be, that's actually going to be useful and that people are happy to or willing and see use in and will take it up as they go.
Perfect. So what I'm wanting to focus on in today's webinar, and you after the webinar that we had a couple of months back with Michael Thompson from Central Queensland University on emerging industries and extension, you forwarded me on a report, which I'll share to everyone in a moment. But you've started the project by really taking the time to understand producer behaviour and mindsets concerning their decision-making during drought, and you've also really looked at their preferences in tools to help frame the project up front. So we frequently discuss the importance of allowing appropriate time for this framing in our extension projects as part of this webinar, so it's really great to see and why I was so keen to get you on board. But why did you think it was important to take this approach?
Basically, we had a bit of a feeling that there was a need for, or there was opportunity for such a tool. But we also wanted to test to make sure that that was true. So we went out and we spoke to producers across the countryside in different states and different production zones, sheep and cattle, to put forward the idea that is this something that may or may not be useful. And we've got a range of different feedback on that, and that's helping us to frame up what our how we approach the project, how we approach the modelling and pulling things together, and then also it will hopefully, with that iteration going back and forth, ensure that we wind up delivering something that people see value in and people will actually be willing to invest a bit of time in to use in the future. And the other thing was, pardon me, we know that there's been a lot of activity in decision making or selecting animals to cull. So we also just wanted to make sure that we were right, that there was a gap in the breeding side of things, and also identify other people who are working within this area of how do you decide which animals to keep and which ones to sell. And so it's been good to sort of be able to bounce ideas back and forth with them and share notes and make sure that we are covering new ground, given that this is a research project. So we've got a little bit of room to get it wrong to a certain degree, but we're aiming to get it right.
Excellent. And I think let's, to frame the conversation early on, we're talking about tools, and one of the things that the project is looking to do is develop a tool or tools that are going to help with this decision making for livestock producers. But what are you considering as a tool in this project?
Yeah. It's a whole range of things, like even a one-page case study or a cheat sheet, where that's something that might just pique a producer's interest to get them to think differently, all the way through to, we may wind up with an app or a widget. Don't quote me on that one. I'm not sure if we really will, but there's quite a gambit there of different things that I think could be considered tools. It doesn't have to be something online. It doesn't have to be an app. It doesn't have to be web-based. It's really something that helps to get people to think and to act differently, I think.
Excellent. And I think, in prepping for this webinar, we had a number of conversations about the fact that often, when we say tool, we do think about an app or a widget or something that's digital and something that's a bit flash. And what we're going to do as we discuss your results a little bit more is that that's not necessarily what producers are wanting. And so it's really good to see that you're doing that work up front. Because as we've sort of been discussing, is that there's a lot of technology products that exist out there that are looking for a problem to solve, whereas you're making sure that what you're doing here is designing a solution that has a ready-made audience. So that's very encouraging to see. All right, so I want to get into the findings of your work then. How did you go about developing your understanding of producer mindsets in drought? What was the methodology?
Yep. So it's very important to note here that most of this, or all this work initially, has been done by Cathy O'Mullen from Central Queensland Uni. And Cathy's a health promotion practitioner with about 20 or over 20 years experience working in that field. So she came in to the project without any agricultural background, and which was quite a good thing. I think it helped quite a lot with her engagement and interaction and her ability to pull information out of producers. So she conducted a series of structured interviews with 30 producers and advisors, so across the Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And during those conversations, she tried to probe and get a good understanding of producers and advisors' understanding and their perception and experience of things like drought, and how that may have changed. It was interesting to see how that may have changed over time. She also was looking at how producers are currently going about making destocking decisions. So what are the sorts of background decisions behind making a culling decision, the scale, the size of a destock event when it happens, what sort of process they went through, and what sort of motivation and factors were they considering when they were coming up to destocking and actually making that move. She's also probing and trying to understand where people get advice, who producers consult with, and whether they're using existing tools or if they had undertaken management, resources, using resources or training and things like that. And then the other side of it was, more general around understanding what sorts of tools producers have been using in the past, not necessarily directly related to culling decisions, but just trying to get an understanding of the barriers and enablers around good tools or tools that producers found useful, and also what they found to be less useful, and what sorts of attributes those tools had that made life, that made them desirable and useful in that sense. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, something that comes up very frequently in this webinar is that there's a bit of engagement fatigue by farmers in terms of participating in whether it be surveys or interviews or those kind of things. Have you got any gold star advice on how to encourage farmer participation so that you can get this information to help guide your projects?
Yeah, I think it was that horrible term that we spoke about the other day, value proposition. There's got to be something in this for the producers. They've got to see some value in what we as researchers may be coming forward with. That's the first thing. But the other thing is also trust. And we sort of spoke about that the other day as well. We were in a pretty privileged position that we've got a number of different staff or team members who have been around in the industry for a long time, and so they're trusted and they have networks and producers who know that in the past we have delivered, and it's probably worth having a conversation at this point in time, whether or not it led anywhere. But so that that's a harder one, and that one takes a lot of time. And then the other thing is, I think we've got to acknowledge that we are researchers, and we don't know the business or the industry the same way that producers do. We've got a different perspective, and we've got to acknowledge that the producers and the advisors are experts in their fields, and pardon the pun, in their paddocks as well. So their views and their opinions are just as valid. It's not just us propeller heads that know everything. Like, we need to take a step back and learn from the other side. And if we acknowledge that, that goes a long ways to helping to build trust, I think. I think I've mentioned, we drew on our network. So having a large network, and because we've got teams, based all around the countryside and from different organisations, we did have networks into different parts of the industry as well.
Perfect. All right, I want to spend a bit of time now exploring your results. So what have you found from the work that Kathy's done? What's come out? Should we perhaps start with some of the state-based differences?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do that. Yep. And there is a full document and a summary document that we'll make available at the end of this too, I should mention. Yeah. So, there was, how do we say this? So I'll just go back and double check the notes again. So some of the, basically there was little interest in the NT in a tool that was going to help make decisions, and that was mostly to do with the fact that the properties up there are massive. And this is quoting producers for want of a better term. They're working on mob-based decisions. Their ability to select on an individual animal basis is very, very difficult. So they weren't super interested in a tool that picked breeders per se. Their general approach is either you're in calf or you're not, and if you're not, you're gone. And that's been working for them. Also, their access to expertise, they tended to maybe look at the history. They knew their country, they'd been there for many generations more often than not, and so they were a little bit more self-reliant and willing to back their own experience rather than go looking for other advice elsewhere. In Queensland, there was mob-based decision-making, mostly dominated up that way as well, but a stronger focus on dollars as opposed to family and lifestyle. So there's a little bit more family and lifestyle focus up in the territory. There'd been a lot of drought in some of the areas of where we were talking to some of the producers, so that had already shifted their focus and the way they approached culling, and for want of a better term, perhaps having a more conservative approach to stocking and destocking overall. The logistics were also a little easier than up in the territory, so it's easier to get animals out of those properties than it might be up in the territory. So if you don't get it right up in the territory in the first instance, then you're stuck. There's also differences in attitude between younger debt-heavy producers compared to older producers who'd been around and possibly owned the farm already. So again, there were differences there, which makes sense. So then down in New South Wales and Victoria, there was a lot of support from producers and mixed support from their advisors around the concept of what we were putting forward. And so a lot of that came back to smaller scale of properties. So producers are looking to optimise their productivity and so looking to get an advantage wherever they can in that sense. There's a lot more use of consultants and more concern about managing the environment in those parts of the world as well. And a lot more focus on genetics as well, I think it's fair to say. And all producers could see value in it if there was an economic value to the individual traits that were perceived to have relevance.
Beautiful. And you've mentioned that the work was also looking at changes in drought perceptions over time. What are you sort of seeing? Is that what are the main drivers for how people are perceiving, is it their experience with drought, or is it, building their business acumen? I imagine it's multifaceted, but was there anything in particular that you were finding was coming through as a key thing that was helping influence changing attitudes to preparedness for drought?
Yeah, I think a lot more producers are now seeing drought as an everyday part of business. It's happening more regularly, and it's just being built in as part of the business. So, in some parts of the country, producers were saying, we expect drought 7 years out of 10, and we just have to manage for that. Particularly down south in Victoria, the The term drought, actually, we were told that drought was not a term that they like to use anymore in certain parts of the state, and they preferred to talk about climate variability. So there was also differences around that as well. So that was quite interesting to see too.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what I've really liked about this piece of work that you've done is the focus on language as well too, and that's really going to come through in the resources that we'll share with everybody at the end. Is that you've gone through and developed a series of fact sheets for both producers and advisors, which really has, it includes in there statements to motivate actions and messages that will resonate with producers in each of those different regions. That you've really focused on how important getting the language is in terms of getting engagement in the first place. So, why was that a particular focus, and was there anything interesting that you were finding in that language space?
I mean, I guess we all talk about speaking the same language, but it's one of the problems when you talk from scientists to producers, that the language is often two foreign languages in a sense. We need to, I shouldn't say dumb it down, but stop using such technical terms and jargon and scientific terms and things like that, and just make sure that we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing, because the perception of what a drought is in one part of the world is complete, or even one part of the country can be quite different to a perception in another part, and those impacts can be quite different. And then language overall. I guess that's been evolving with time, as I think climate change, or whatever you want to call it, has become a little bit more accepted, that actually we can see that things are changing, and we're not going to stick our heads in the sand.
Excellent. So it's interesting you mentioned, I've come a couple of, spoken on a number of previous webinars sort of about, getting language right from both the research to the producer end. So what have sort of been the reactions to this work, given that traditional decision-making models have tended to emphasise this rational evaluation, but what your work is showing is that, these emotional, intuitive factors in decision-making processes are really important in helping guide practice change?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit too early to say too much about that, because at the moment we've been mostly working internally on the project with the project team, but it's certainly helping us to form up the way we will be presenting our results and the way a tool might look, or the sorts of information that might be presented, with regards to different risk profiles and things like that, and different, how we frame future scenarios. So whether someone might be risk averse or quite keen to take risk, that will depend on that will help to inform how or what sorts of options are put forward going forward in that sense. So hope that answers the question.
Yes. Let's get into the tool part now. I want to spend a bit of time getting your thoughts on tool usage. And so, as I mentioned earlier, often, organisations can tend to gravitate towards apps and digital products as, this is what we want to create. They always look good. But we're often finding, and your findings are confirming this, that for farmers, tools like Excel are still what they're wanting to use or what they find the most reliable. So how will you approach this misalignment with what you're going to do, with where you're going next in the Decide and Thrive project?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes back to transparency and the ability to understand what the tool is and how it works, so you can trust what comes out of it, the answers that come out of the tool. Another thing, the other side is that they've got to be easy to use in that sense, with low investment, I think, in the first instance with regards to, getting data across. So if you're already collecting data in another system, whether that be weights or whatever it may be, traits on animals, you're already using one system, you want to be able to get that information across the other one fairly simply in a straightforward fashion with as little time, effort and investment as required. So making sort of easy wins, or making it easy, is really what it comes back to in the first instance, I think, to then once it's easy, to show what can be done and have some small wins, that's useful, that was interesting, and then get a bit more buy-in, a little bit more interest in the tool, and the ability to then move forward and maybe spend more time on it, invest more time on it thereafter.
So if we can look at the Northern Territory as a particular example where, you know, the work has sort of showed that there's not much of an aptitude, interest in towards a digital tool up there. So will you step away from that completely?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, I think at this point in time, maybe we're a bit too early for that for that actual tool, but I think there's value in having the conversation and, putting out there are other ways to do things. It doesn't mean that people have to do them that way, and it may well be that in the current circumstances, the way things are being done is the best way to do things, but shouldn't preclude conversations and discussions and people thinking about maybe doing things differently and how they might adapt what comes out of this project to their own circumstances and take the bits that they find useful and interesting and see if they can do something with that. So I think there's always value in having those conversations and just putting the information out there and generating a discussion, if nothing else.
Yeah, okay, so good focus on the learnings. I think it's, I really like that example, with that we go that, yes, there's interest in it in some areas, but not necessarily in others, and that we shouldn't necessarily see that as a failure. And I think that that's actually good about putting this focus up front. Is that we can go, well, we're aware that this is probably going to be challenging in this particular region. And so we're going into that with our eyes wide open instead of developing something up front and going, oh, well, why isn't it working here? So, it's lovely to have that evidence base up front. What other barriers were you sort of finding in terms of livestock producers' use of tools more generally? What were you finding as sort of some of the key things that were preventing or frustrating or causing people to stop using some of the things that they are using?
Yeah. It's a little bit like some of the things I already mentioned with the amount of time and effort it takes to get set up in a system and to bring your data across. And you might already be using one system where you're spending time and effort to capture data, whatever that may be, and then you want to do something with it in another system that does something different. That inability to transfer smoothly and seamlessly across to the next system, that's very, very frustrating for everyone involved, I think, in that sense. What else is there? Again, making it easy. That's sort of already touched on that. Remind me what the question was, sorry, mate.
So what are the barriers to tool use by livestock producers?
Yeah, I think mostly it's time and effort. People are busy doing plenty of things on farm as it is, and then you're asking them to do more and more. Unless you can see real value in it, it's going to make life difficult for anyone to keep interest.
Excellent. All right. So in the work that you've done then, did you find anything that was new or surprising to you and the team?
Look, to be honest, and at the risk of sounding like an arrogant twat, I don't think so. I think it confirmed a lot of our understanding and our expectations. So I don't think that it was a problem that we didn't find anything new or exciting in that sense. But it really helps to confirm that we had a gut feel that we were on the right track. And having had the conversations, that makes sense, and that's good, and it's it gives us confidence that what we are doing will probably have value, so long as we keep in touch with the end users and the people who are going to be working along the way. Yeah.
I was talking to a market researcher the other day, and they were saying that if you do find out something really surprising in your market research, then you potentially don't know your audience as well as you should. So my question was going to be, is it a bad thing that you haven't learned anything too surprising, which obviously isn't. All right, so you've got these findings in the report. You've done these really fantastic fact sheets, or the team have done those, which I'll share with everybody now. What next? Where do you go from here?
Yep, so now it's a lot of within project work, collecting the data and then trying to put models together. So we're looking at, basically the whole aim of the project is to try and quantify short and long-term consequences, whether that be to the production or environment or finances, from using the different traits to select which animals which breeders to sell and which ones to keep. So there's a fair bit of modelling going on around there to have a look at which traits are important, and then generating scenarios, going into the future to see, well, what if we select this particular animal here? What sort of impact will that have going forward? on short term, medium term, and long term. So there's a lot of number crunching basically at this point in time, and then working out different sorts of profiles and probabilities to try and work out whether this is a low risk, high risk type approach, and then to be able to put those forward to producers to, for want of a better term, self-identify whether they're willing, what their risk profile might be, and therefore which sort of approach or which they might be most comfortable taking.
Excellent. And extension and communication plans from here on in?
Yep. I mean, at the moment we're about to push out, and that's part of today's conversation, a lot of the findings and the project documents that you've already mentioned. And then it'll be keeping people up to date with what we're doing, and then working with the industry to get feedback on, okay, this is how we're approaching things, this is how we think it works, this is how we think it might be best presented, but getting feedback as to whether that's really going to work for them or not.
Yeah, perfect. So sending out the findings and going, all right, where do we take this? Who can we work with from here on in to get this out there? So then, based on what you've found, what's your advice for any extension practitioners that we might have in our audience today who are working with livestock producers? What can they go out and do based on what you found?
At the moment, there's probably not heaps because we haven't got too much to put out there. Other than there's the information in the documents around framing conversations. And I won't say that we've come up with anything necessarily new and earth-breaking and earth-shattering in that sense. I think there's probably a lot of advisors that will say, yeah, well, we sort of know that already. But there is some tips and tricks in there if you're starting conversations with new clients or potential clients around how to frame those conversations and what sort of language may be appropriate in certain parts of the world and certain parts of the industry.
Excellent. Now, before we head into, we always finish up these webinars with a little bit of show and tell, and that's where we recognise that in a short webinar it's not going to be enough to get a huge amount of information. So this is the part where Pete, you get to share the books, papers, anything like that you learn from. But now's the opportunity that if people have any questions for Pete, or if they have any feedback on what's been shared so far, we can also provide Pete's details, because obviously Pete is here looking for feedback on how this project can be used and applied. So now's the opportunity to get typing if you've got any questions or comments. But while we give people the opportunity to have a think about any questions that they might have, Pete, show and tell. Where do you get your information from? What information do you like? Papers? I've got a particular one that you shared with me yesterday, which I'll share now, which is the Cam Nicholson GRDC farm decision making one. But what do you listen to?
Not much. Too busy running around chasing animals at the moment. No, I think that one, I quite like the Cam Nicholson, the GRDC publication. That's more about how you make decisions and framing decisions, which is the side of the work that we aren't focusing on within the project. That's an area that I would have liked to have lent the project towards, but we're focusing more on the decisions have been made. Now we're going to try and, for want of a better term, optimise which animals to choose from there. Yeah.
All right, we'll give people the opportunity to ask a couple more questions if they've got the time to pop stuff in. Otherwise, we can wrap up there. Any last comments, Pete, before we wrap up?
No, I think that's about it. Other than, we'll try and stay in touch with everyone and let them know where we're up to. And if anyone has any comments, please feel free to reach out and get in touch.
All right. Got no chats, no questions or comments coming through. If you do, you can flick them through to me and I can get you in touch with Pete. But Pete, we're going to thank you now very much for coming in today. We appreciate your time, and thank you very much to our audience for joining in. We hope that this has stimulated your thinking, and if you're planning to do something different from today's information, we would love to hear it in the comments. I'm now going to pop up on your screen the registration for our September webinar, and you should see a link pop up that you can register now. Our guest for September is going to be Karen Kime, who is the First Nations Engagement Officer at the Southern New South Wales Drought, Resilience, Adoption and Innovation Hub, who is the host of this webinar. And we're going to be having a discussion with Karen about how best to engage and design RD&E that considers and includes First Nation perspectives, experiences and expertise. So we're very much looking forward to that conversation conversation with Karen and hearing about the work that she does right through with the Southern New South Wales Hub right across the Southern New South Wales region. Now, once this webinar finishes, you're going to be directed to a survey link. I know nobody likes doing these, but it would be very much appreciated if you could please fill it out. We've tried to design it so it doesn't take any more than a minute, and the input is really important to us. We do often, I look for what you provide in there to identify speakers and topics for future webinars to try and get stuff that meets your need. So if you could fill that out, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you for participating in today's Expanded Horizons webinar delivered by the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. I hope you have a lovely day.